Welcome to another edition of Soundstage, a public program brought to you by the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music on the campus of Monmouth University. I'm Bob Santelli, your host. You know, when Arlo Guthrie wrote Alice's Restaurant back in the mid-1960s, he had no idea that the song would become pop music's unofficial Thanksgiving song. And yet, that's exactly what it's become. Today, we're visiting with Arlo in his home in Western Massachusetts, and this being November, just a week away from Thanksgiving, let's get the story behind the song, as well as insight into Arlo's recent decision to end his touring days after more than a half century of playing concerts around the world. Arlo, it's good to see you.
I'm doing good, Bob. It's nice to see you.
And you too. So we're talking to you from the Berkshires in Massachusetts, I presume.
That's exactly right. I'm here in Western Massachusetts. It's a fabulous day, and we've never done this before. I mean, we've talked before, but never online or something.
No, this is the first time. This is the first
Yes.
time. We've done a few things. I remember we've done some things at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Of course, we did Centennial together and, interviews down the road, but this is the first time on a Zoom, right?
Yes, I love it.
Well,
I don't have to leave home for this.
That's it. Well, look, obviously the thing I'd like to start off with is really your recent announcement. I think it might have taken a number of your fans by surprise, but you announced your retirement.
Well, what I announced really was nuanced. It was a retirement from the road, which is not really retiring. It's just that the idea of spending 6 to 9 months a year in a 45-foot tin can was not appealing to me at this point in my life. I had some medical issues and some other stuff, and the idea of knowing, I mean, you got to take this back to the beginning of March, and we had a show we were doing in Tennessee, and I got home, and the next day, everything shut down. So all the gigs we had planned for that tour were postponed, and then they were rescheduled, and then they were canceled, and then they were rescheduled again, and then they were rescheduled again. And it got to the point where now we're looking at 2022, and I said, you know what? I don't know if I'm going to be in any kind of shape to be able to guarantee that will be the same performer that people have come to know and expect, let alone the expectations I had of myself. And so I said, it's easier now to just cancel that part of it and and the funny thing happened that as soon as I made the announcement that I was no longer going to spend time on the road and no longer accepting gigs, something changed. And I know a lot of people read that as retirement, although it's not really retirement. What it is saying, okay, sell the freaking tour bus, because we're not doing that anymore. But what changed was that over, I'd say, the past 5 years, when I would get home, and I would get home 2 weeks or a week here, maybe 3 weeks over the holidays, even maybe a little bit longer. But the rest of the time, we had scheduled to be on tour, out on the road. I've been doing that for 50 years. And in the last 5 years of it, I noticed something really odd. And that was when I pulled into the house, I left my instruments on the tour bus. I didn't feel like playing them anymore. And I thought, that's weird. Guitar has been your best friend for 50 years. Even before that, I mean, I started playing when I was a little kid, but I didn't feel like playing anymore. And as soon as I made the announcement and that cloud of upcoming rescheduled doom and gloom was lifted, I was looking at my guitar and I said, man, you need some new strings, buddy, you know. And I started playing again. and I'm having a ball.
Good.
And the playing is not just comfort for me, it's therapy. I lost a little bit of use in my hands. It was a little more difficult to play. And I thought I needed the time on stage to get that back. Because I know from experience, I mean, I've been doing this a long time. If I took off more than a month, it would take me a few nights of playing to get back into the whole thing. Well, now I've been off for 6 months or whatever it is. And I thought, I don't want to go through that process of relearning, especially under the conditions that I'm in now, of how to play the freaking guitar, because I know how to play it. It's just that physically I couldn't do it. Yeah. So when you know something in your head and your hands know a different thing, it becomes problematic. And I said, time to call that quits. And it's been a lot of fun. I've been relearning how to play and I love it.
The band, your backing band, was kind of like a family affair. How does this affect Abe and others in the band? How does this affect their careers and lives?
Well, I mean, I think it's something you think about, but you don't really give any credence to it. But I've been working with these guys in my band. It's the same band that I started with in 1976. So there might have been a few personnel changes, you know, people come and go or they return or something like that. But essentially, it's the same people I've been working with, not just the band, but the crew.
Yeah.
Same road manager that I started working with in 1976, the same drummer. Abe started playing with us, I guess, in the early 80s when he was just a kid. And I think everybody had grown to be like family. So when I told them that we weren't doing that anymore, the first question was, well, what are we doing? And we answered that really quickly. We went back to the old church that had become famous as a result of being in the Arthur Penn movie, Alice's Restaurant. And we started doing some tunes together. Even though I wasn't up to speed, it was still a lot of fun to work with them. And I expect that that will continue, that we will do as much as we can do, and then put it online instead of getting in a tour bus together and going down the road. We will try to do more online performances as best we can. And hopefully my staying at home and working out my hands, my vocals and stuff like that, will make it so that we can just continue to do this until I'm not here.
Right, right. You mentioned, okay, you're getting off the road, but what about songwriting? I mean, you know, there's that, you're sitting at home, you're enjoying yourself, the pressure's off. Are you songwriting? Are you writing things?
Well, I have two minds about it. The first thing was, I've written so many songs already that I didn't find it really necessary to create new ones during the last few years on the road. A lot of the things that we were going through. I mean, a folk singer's job, if I can quote my dad, is to comfort the, well, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, a folk singer's job is to comfort the discomforted and discomfort the comfortable. And I had enough tools in my toolbox to do that without trying to think of something new. Not only that, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, this really isn't my world anymore. I'm of an age where this world belongs to one or two generations younger than me. And if there's going to be new songs, and if there's going to be new voices, it has to come from them. And it's time for people like me to, it doesn't mean you go away, but it means you stand aside and you let somebody else say something. I was used to performing in a world that I thought was mine. I was part of the world in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, even into the 90s. But at some point I realized, wait a minute, this isn't your world anymore, buddy. You know, stand aside, let somebody else speak. And I have learned to do that as graciously as I could. It's not easy, but I saw it happen with my old buddy Pete Seeger when he called me up one day in his 80s. And we had been used to doing these shows together for since the early 70s, late 60s. And we never did tours, but we did about a dozen shows a year together. And they were maybe the most fun shows of the fun. It was the most fun part of my career because we never had a preset plan. We never had a set list. We walked out and we swapped songs, and we weren't aligned exactly philosophically. I think basically we were in the same ballpark, but we were in different parts of that ballpark. And so we had fun together, making those arguments, as it were, on stage before a lot of people who were also having those same arguments. And but he called me up when he was 80 something and he said, Arlo, I can't do those big shows with you anymore. I can't play like I used to play, and I can't sing like I used to sing. And I said to him, Pete, look at our audience. They can't hear like they used to hear. It might not be a problem. He said, well, maybe you're right. And we played for another 15 years together without thinking about how we sounded or how we looked. But I realized at some point, you have to stand aside a little bit. You have to at least give other people room. And Pete was giving me that room as a young man. And I had to learn to give it to other people. And hopefully that's exactly what will happen now.
Well, it's a point well taken. You mentioned Pete, and of course, I'm from back east, and I remember, like all of us who grew up and lived in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, those famous shows, Thanksgiving shows at Carnegie Hall. And of course, it's November now. And when's the last time you did it? And what's your most treasured memory from playing those Carnegie Hall shows?
Well, the wonderful thing was that I first started playing at Carnegie Hall when I was 20. I did my first show there. It was a solo show. It was just me. And over the years, I'd say by far most of them were with Pete. And we wouldn't do just one night, but we would do a couple of nights. We would always try to do the Friday and Saturday after Thanksgiving. That became the ritual. And so at some point maybe about 2 years ago, I thought, you know what, Pete's gone. And as much fun as we had doing it, I think it's time to call that quits. And so last November, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, was the last time I did a show at Carnegie Hall. I didn't know at the time that it would have been the last show at Carnegie Hall anyway, because of the pandemic. But I think we made the right call. But the most fun I think I ever had was one time, not too many years ago. Pete was 94, and we decided that I talked him into doing the show with me. He wasn't, in the last few years, he didn't presume that he was going to do that. And we talked, and he said, Arlo, I can't remember any songs. I know 4. I thought, Pete's being Pete. He actually knows more songs than he remembers he knows. The fact that he can't remember he knows them is what the problem is. It's not that he doesn't know the songs, he just doesn't know that he knows them. So I got together with all of my kids and my grandkids, and there's about 15 of them, it's 16, something like that. And I decided that we would do Pete Seeger songs. And so we rehearsed them in secret so that he wouldn't find out about it. Because if it had any hint of being a tribute to him, he wouldn't show up, right? So we rehearsed the songs, and then we walked out on stage together. And we started playing some of these songs, and he'd say, "Oh, yeah, I know that one." And he'd get up and start playing, you know, or sit there and start playing, whatever. And we went through a night of swapping songs as we always had. The only difference was that we had to start the songs so that he could remember that he knew it too. And he still sang in tune, and he still played in tune. And there was, at 94, I mean, I thought that was amazing. And I remember when he walked out there, at this point, he had 2 metal canes that he was walking with. I mean, he could barely get around. But he walked out there, and that audience stood up, and they cheered for about 10 minutes, which on stage is a long freaking time, because every second seems like an hour. It seemed like interminable. It was just going on, and we couldn't even start the show because people were cheering him. And it didn't matter what he sounded like, and it didn't matter what he played like. It's what he stood for that people were cheering. And the fact that I was there to witness that made my life more worth living at that time. I just thought it was the most tremendous. I will never forget it.
Well, truly, he was a great man, great. His contributions to American music are impossible to categorize or even describe. He's been such an inspiration. He's been such a great ambassador of American folk music. But you, speaking of Thanksgiving, you also have your part in it. And of course, when I think of Thanksgiving, the first thing that always comes to my mind, aside from football, is Alice's Restaurant. And that's something that, of course, you've contributed to the American music treasury. And it's something that, I always wanted to ask you about the origins of that. I know you've spoken about it a long time, but for the record, go back in time and take us to those days when this song has started to become real and how it actually happened.
Well, it is a long time ago, but in 1965, I had returned from a trip overseas, and I was singing on the streets of Europe, and mostly in like Denmark and Copenhagen. And so I was making some money just, standing there with an open guitar case, singing my songs. But I had enrolled in a college in Billings, Montana. So I knew I had to get back. And so I left Europe and I went to school in Montana, because in those days, you were either going to school or you were going to Vietnam.
Right.
And I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I was opposed to the war in principle. I was opposed to it politically, and I was opposed to the draft that said that everybody had to go no matter what you thought about it. And so being in college was a refuge from that threat. But along comes November of 1965. Everybody goes home for the Thanksgiving vacation. And I ended up visiting my friends that lived in this old church and took out their garbage and put it in the wrong place, and wrote a song about it. But at the same time, now that I decided I wasn't going back to college, despite the threat. And so at the same time that I was visiting my friends, I was dealing with, at that point, the military, because they knew that I wasn't in college anymore, and they wanted to talk to me about it. And I went down a number of times to the local facility and talked to them about it. And eventually they said, well, you're going to be inducted, you know. And I went down to be inducted. When they told me I wasn't fit for military service because I had a littering conviction, I couldn't believe it. I thought, boy, these guys are stupid. I mean, you can't run a country like this. You can't run a war like this. This is just ridiculous. And so I was retelling these accounts from night to night in these little folk clubs or coffee houses, whatever we had. And it grew over a period of, I would say, about a year and a half into this epic tale that we have come to know as Alice's Restaurant. And the fact that it took place on Thanksgiving is the only reason that I am remembered on Thanksgiving. I mean, it's just a crazy coincidence. It could have been Easter, or it might not have been a holiday at all. And it probably wouldn't have the legs that it has. But the coincidences of fate made it so that every Thanksgiving we will get one day of airplay on the radio. And I always thought, hey, if you're going to get one time when they play you on one day, it might as well be the longest thing you ever wrote. So I was happy about that. And they still continue to do that. And I'm thankful for, the interest and the support of people who continued that tradition.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the writing of that song as a burden that, oh God, they're going to ask me to do it again? Because it's not a 2-minute song, as you say. You got some time to put into that song. So did it become a burden over the years?
The real burden of it began in its inception. When I went to record it for the first time, we went to a recording studio in New York City, and they wanted a live audience as part of the recording. But I was like 18 or 19, something like that. So I didn't have a say in who went. That was the producer, Fred Hellerman, and Harold Leventhal, those two guys. And they had been friends of the family and so forth and so on. I had a long history with them. And they were the ones that decided that it needed to have a live audience, and I was thankful. But I didn't realize that live audience was going to be people who have already heard the song. So the first horror for me was trying to tell a joke to people that had already heard it a million times. So although it made people happy to hear it, they weren't projecting that happiness in terms of laughter, or there was no surprise. And I was used to performing the song for people who had never heard it before, and you could feel that laughter. I mean, I knew what was coming, but they didn't. And that made me very happy. And I remember the day when I thought, okay, that time is gone. Everybody who's coming to hear you now has heard that song already. They know what's coming, just like you do. And it may make them happy, but they're not going to be laughing like they were when they hadn't heard it before. So it started at the very first time we recorded it, and it went on for years. And after a while, I thought, it's not worth the 20 minutes it takes. I mean, a concert is only an hour and a half, 2 hours. So if you're taking a quarter of the time, a third of the time to sing one song that everybody's already heard, it's not going to be interesting. And not only that, it will diminish the remaining time I have, because there are also other expectations, because there had to be Woody Guthrie songs in there included. There had to be some, other material. After 1972, there had to be City of New Orleans. They had to be Coming into Los Angeles after 1969, or whenever that record came out of Woodstock. So there were songs that we were required to do, and one of the requirements at that time was Alice's Restaurant. And I thought, no, that's not fair to the audience. It's not fair to me. And so I decided at some point that we were going to do it every 10 years. And we would do it for about a year or two, however long it took to crisscross the country a few times so everybody could have a shot at it. And that's exactly what we did. And so we recorded the 30th anniversary of it. We recorded a 40th anniversary, and we recorded a 50th anniversary back in 2015. And I kept my word. I had to relearn the whole freaking thing every time, but I did it. I was happy I did it. And I'm also equally happy that we didn't do it for that whole time. Even though there were people getting, pissed off at me and saying, I'm never coming back. I paid money to hear that song, whatever. I said, fine, see you in 10 years,
Well, that song, of course, is now a part of the American music treasury, and we're grateful that you wrote it. And I can say that one of my highlights going to your concerts for so many years is I got to see you do it a couple of times, and I never thought for a moment that it wasn't as fresh as the day you recorded it. So thank you.
That's because of you. That's you, Bob. There were a lot of people who said, oh no, let's go have a drink while he's doing that.
You mentioned your dad, Woody, and of course, for those students listening, I think it's important just to get some reflections, because obviously you talk about burdens. Woody could have been a big burden around your neck. He's one of the American, just an American treasure, written over 3,000 songs, including This Land Is Your Land, has influenced so many people from Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Pete Seeger on down, a monument in American music. And yet, despite your genes and your heritage, you were able to create your own career. You were able to acknowledge him and be inspired by him, but still have your own career. You're your own person on stage and in a recording studio. Was that difficult to do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I didn't do anything else, so I can't compare it. But I thought the one interesting feature of having that family involvement was that, just like any family that does something, it's easy for the kids to slip into the same genre. If you're a shoemaker, it's easy for your kid to become a shoemaker. If you're a barber, it's easy for your kid to become a barber. Doesn't mean they don't want to do other things, and it doesn't mean that most of them don't. But those who choose to do it already know something that if you were starting out to do it from scratch and nobody in your family had ever done it before, is a little more difficult. But it's a world, and it's assumptions about the world that you bring with you when you continue the work of either both or one of your parents or somebody in your family, or some world that you grew up in, whatever it was. And for me, I always considered it a shame that my father didn't live long enough for me to share that with him personally. So his passing happened within weeks of my beginning. And he heard the acetate to Alice's Restaurant before it came out as a record. You know, in the early days before they made vinyl, they would make test pressings. And his manager, who was also my manager, a guy named Harold Leventhal, brought those acetates to my father in the hospital where he was and played them for him. And he got a kick out of it. Couldn't really talk about it. He couldn't talk. But he enjoyed it. That's all I ever got from my dad, except what I made up in my mind. And in my mind, I was going to continue his philosophical work, which meant that I had to, first of all, understand what was the stuff holding him together? What was the stuff that made him want to write the kinds of songs he wrote or do the kind of material he did? And I think I've whittled it down to that it's better to fail at being yourself than to succeed at being somebody else. He had an innate belief in the value of every human being. No matter what their story was, no matter what their politics or their race or their gender or all of that stuff aside, everybody had like snowflakes, because each one is unique. And there could be billions and billions of them, and they could be similar, but nobody's exactly the same as anybody else. And that therefore, when all of those unique people start working together, you can do things, you can make progress in this world. And he was convinced that if he could give people the belief that their voices counted, that he would move the world a little bit. And I think he did.
Yeah, he did.
And one of the, like I said, I'll tell you a funny story. I was in whenever it was, had to be late 80s or something like, maybe early 80s. I was in the studio mixing a record of a film that we had made. It was called Woody Guthrie, Hard Traveling. And it came about as a result of me seeing a movie called Bound for Glory that was based loosely on his autobiography. But I thought the movie was pretty terrible. And I wanted to talk to people on camera who were actually there before they got old and passed away. I wanted to get their faces and their voices and their memories on the record, as it were. And so we made a little film. It was not very popular ever, but it was called Woody Guthrie, Hard Traveling. And the soundtrack to that was all of these people singing and playing and with me. And we were having a lot of fun together. But in the studio, I decided to try something really weird. And that was to take my father's recording that he had made of This Land Is Your Land and sing with him, especially because he had written 6 verses to the song, but only recorded 3 of them. So I thought, okay, let's see if we can't do this. Now, this is before digital, right? This is analog days. So we're listening to the recording, and the first thing is, it's not in any particular key. It's between keys. And I thought, okay, well, you can tune a guitar any way you want, as long as it's in tune to itself. With him, that's rare, right? So, but as long as you can tune it to itself, it can be in any key, it doesn't matter. So I had trouble doing that. And I had to make my new guitar, new recording equipment, sound like his, so that I could fill in and play instrumental verses for me to sing to, even though his was going on in and out. But we didn't want that. We wanted that to be seamless. So I couldn't do it. It was just impossible. I thought there must be something wrong. So I listened to the rest of the recordings on this record, and I'm listening to my father play his guitar, and all of a sudden he started playing harmonica. And I said, wait a minute, you can tune a guitar any way you want, but you can't tune a harmonica. And that harmonica is not in any particular key. Something's wrong. And I was there with my sister in the studio, and we sped up the tape a little bit to the next real key. So that harmonica was now in tune. And I looked at my sister, and she had tears in her eyes. She said, that's the voice. That's the voice I remember. And after that moment, we realized that the original recordings of my father that had been around for 30 or 40 years had all been recorded off speed, some more than others. And I could now tell, because the way you make a record, of course, is you record a bunch of songs, you pick which ones, right? And you put them on the final record. I could tell by how off they were, or how far off they were, I should say, which songs were recorded when. Mm. And I put that together, and my sister and I went to all of the people who were putting out those records and said, from now on, you need to change what you're putting out, because we have heard Woody Guthrie sing these songs, and they have not been his real voice. They have been it's not his real guitar playing. And it's been adjusted now, as far as I know. And we were successful in duplicating the sound of his recording environment to the point where I could sing with him. And that moment, when I had my dad in my headphones, he might as well have been in the next room, because it was just in here, right? And with the kind of separation that people do today when they record, they're either in a different room or in some kind of barrier or something, so that you can adjust the sound and the levels of the recording to make it so that one's not overpowering and one's not underpowering. And so that was the fun of working with my dad. It has not been a burden to do that. It has been a pleasure, both personally and professionally. And I'm grateful that I grew up in that kind of family, which, by the way, I made my kids do also. So my kids all play. Their kids all play. Whether they're professional or not doesn't concern me. But music is a language, and it's good to know how to speak it or play it, because then you can go anywhere in the world and you can sit down with a guy or a gal that you've never seen before. You can't speak their language, but if you can play an instrument, you can join in and have that look in your eye that says, we're doing the same thing. We're creating something here. This is new. And that feeling can only happen when you understand the language of music, or you understand the actual verbal language that somebody's talking. There are other ways to do it, but music is one of them, and it's an important one.
You talk about This Land Is Your Land, Arlo, and I remember you telling me a story of you going to school in Brooklyn and experiencing This Land Is Your Land for the first time. I would wonder if you would just recount that a bit for students, for people who've never heard it, because it's a classic story, and it really shows the extent of Woody's influence at a time in the 1950s when it wasn't exactly he wasn't exactly at the top of the pop charts, or nor was folk music in general.
No, in those days, I would say in the mid 50s, folk music was just becoming popularized, but they were pop versions, you might say. The Kingston Trio and the Limelighters, and later on Peter, Paul, and Mary, and others had made the kind of songs I had heard listenable on a national or international level. They actually sang in tune. They actually played instruments that were in tune. Somebody was paying attention. It became more professional. But for me as a kid, you don't think about any of that stuff. What you think about is, who's winning the baseball game or something like whatever we were thinking when we were kids. And I remember in the 5th grade, I went to a new school, a different school than the regular public school that I had been enrolled in. And the teacher at that school, that was the music teacher, was a woman named Margot Mayo. I don't know if you know that name, but she was the preeminent square dance and Appalachian music expert on the East Coast. She knew her stuff. And I walked into school and all the kids stood up and they started singing "This Land Is Your Land." And I was the only one there that didn't know how it went, because nobody in my family we didn't grow up learning my dad's songs. It wasn't a household thing. The first record I ever bought was like the Everly Brothers or something. So Woody Guthrie, I knew he was a folk singer. I knew he'd written some famous songs, but I didn't realize that other people knew them too. And it had never occurred to me. And so I went home and I told my father what had happened. And he just laughed and he took me out in the backyard, put a little guitar in my hands, which I still have, that little guitar. And he showed me how to play it. And once I had learned how to play the chords, he taught me the words. And once I had the words done, he taught me the verses that weren't recorded. And once I was armed with the entire song, it became a part of my repertoire later on. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to record it for this hard traveling video, because they weren't verses I had heard from Pete Seeger. They were a little different than Pete's versions. And I knew that my father and Pete and others in the early years had kicked these songs around together. And each one of them was able to modify it a little bit. They weren't so sticky as to being authentic. There was no such thing. Each person had to be authentic to themselves, not to some group idea or not to some copywritten book version. And so I had a little different memory of the verses my father taught me than the ones Pete were singing from time to time. It doesn't mean that my father didn't write all of them. He wrote the same song 15 different ways. And he'd cross out some lines and rearrange them. But I had a lot of people over the years ask me, well, why did people purposely leave out the 3 verses? My father's the one that edited it, not me, and nobody else did. He's the one that decided that those 3 verses that he wrote were the better ones, that spoke more to the effort at hand, and that the other ones maybe were more hard-hitting, but they weren't as important to him as the ones that he originally recorded. So there wasn't any kind of devious effort to keep half of the song out. It was just too long. And because in those days, you recorded on 78 records and you only had few minutes on each side. So rather than break up the songs had to conform to the time that you had on each side of those old 78 records, which was maybe 3 or 4 minutes at most.
Yeah. And those three verses were really relevant for the times, but later on they were almost like topical verses, right? Song verses. They were about the depression and the things that were going on in 1940, 39, 40, etc. By the time that song becomes popular in the 60s or so, that would have become a little bit, I won't say irrelevant, but not as important as the other verses in the song.
I'd say, well, I'd go a little further and say that some of them might be more important now
Yeah.
than the original verses, but those things change. The importance of those things have evolved. Some of them have become less important, some have become more, but that doesn't mean that next week other ones will be more important. And I think that's what you have to live with in this world.
Yeah, and it's the beauty of a folk song as well, right? The ability to invent and reinvent itself as needed. I won't keep you too much longer, but I do have a couple of other questions, Arlo, before we leave. You know, you've been in the business a long time. You say 50 years, 50 plus years, if you go all the way back with your days in Greenwich Village as a young kid before a record deal comes along. Business certainly has changed. And for those students out there who are listening, who have aspirations to be in the business, what advice would you give them? What should they, what are some of the fundamental pillars of being a recording artist or being a creative musician that you would like to pass on to them?
Well, it's hard for me to say because most people, especially young people that aspire to the music business or the music industry, have other motives other than just doing it. Either you see it as being important or see it as becoming famous or see it, I mean, that's not the only motivation, but these are all mixed together. I have met a lot of well-known people who are not very important. And I have met a lot of important people who are not very well known. Nobody writes an 18-minute monologue to become a popular singer. Or if you do, you're just stupid. And so I was never one that was motivated to become a popular singer. I thought it was important, and it was fun for me. And so if you're enjoying it, that's the first thing you have to have, right? The second thing is you have to be smarter than me. I sold Alice's Restaurant to the publisher for $1 because that's what the going rate was when I was a kid. Very few popular musicians these days make that mistake. So the second thing is you have to have a more educated view of how you make a living doing this stuff. Publishing is probably where it's at, unless you are a stage performer yourself and not just a writer or a singer or something like that in the studio. But if you actually go out on the road and make your living doing that, like I did, the next most important thing, or maybe even the most important thing, is publishing. So I would say to any kid that's, by kid, I mean anybody under 50, the most important thing is to take responsibility for the business part of your work. Because if you don't do it, somebody will. It used to be that, for example, that songs that nobody knew who to credit were called traditional. And when that said traditional on a record, that meant that you didn't get any royalties for it because you acknowledged that it was in fact, traditional. I didn't know that when it says traditional, the record company makes that money. They just don't have to give it to you. And so now you have to put traditional, arranged, and adapted, or something like that. I don't know what the new phraseology is, but who knew? The other thing that I learned was that the real creativity in the music industry is not in the musicians, it's in the accounting. That's where the creative genius is. So if you are a creative genius, forget about being a musician, become an accountant. Unless you are compelled to play music like I was, your best shot at having a long and creative life is in accounting. I mean, Alice's Restaurant, I think, came out in 1967. I think I got my first check about 10 or 20 years ago for $500. How did they do that? How did they do that? I mean, the album went gold and then it went platinum, and I mean, it sold over 1 million copies, let alone made over $1 million. Sold over 1 million copies at $10 a pop. How is it that they didn't have to pay me anything for all this time? Well, it turned out that the records they were making more recently, and by more recently, I mean 30 years ago, were designed, it seems to me, to lose money so that they could take the proceeds from the earlier records that were making money and deduct it against the cost of the record they were making. Well, we used to call that cross-collateralization or something like that. I don't know what they call it these days. Basically, it's thievery. But it is so incredibly genius. It is so admirably creative that I remember when I discovered this, I went to the president of Warner Brothers. I said, introduce me to those people. I want to shake their hands. I know they screwed me, but it was done so cleverly and so wonderfully that that's where the creativity is here. It's not in musicians like me, it's them. I want to meet them. And I went down and I did. And I met them and I shook their hands and I said, you guys are freaking great. You know, this is where it's at.
Well, that's a good lesson for young people to learn. I'm sorry you had to be the one to teach it to them in that manner. But, well, I had no idea. I had no idea that that's all you ever made from Alice's Restaurant. It took that long to get a check. That's sad.
Yeah, I mean, but you know what? I'm not complaining about it. It makes a good story.
It does. It does. Sounds like a song.
I remember after Woodstock, a guy came to me and said, Arlo, we want you to play another festival like Woodstock, this time down in Florida. I said, no. I said, we're going to double what you made. I think it was, they paid me like $5 grand or something like that. They will pay you 10 grand. All you have to do is show up, sing, you know, half hour. I said, no. They said, really? I said, yeah. Came back a year later. Arlo, we'll quadruple it. We'll give you 20 grand. That's $1 grand a minute. I'm making the story a lot shorter than it actually took place. $1 grand a minute, even by today's standards, that's pretty good. I said, no. He said, how come? I said, you don't understand. I'll be telling this story for the rest of my life. If I had the money, I would have spent it by now. But I've got a story I can tell forever.
And that is a great story. Arlo, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure talking with you. I hope that you don't go away, that we do get to see you, hear you online at your convenience, in the comfort of your own home or at the church. But you have certainly made your mark in American music, and I'll never forget the opportunity I had to work with you when we celebrated Woody's centennial in 2012, and we did all those shows and events, and it was a real honor to me, and it's something I won't ever forget. Thank you again.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
You bet, Arlo. Okay, take care.